So now the boycott has started. You mentioned a couple names, or you mentioned E.D. Nixon. Um, could you say a little bit more about who this man is as a really important grassroots leader before we kind of move further into the boycott?
E.D. Nixon is active in several ways. I would pay particular attention to sort of his work with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids. This is a sort of a national sort of African American labor union of which he is a part. And it illustrates sort of how he, as an activist in Montgomery, was connected to, and was operating within a larger network. Um, and he was also active in the NAACP. And so he knew Rosa Parks obviously very well. And he not only worked with people like Rosa Parks, but as I mentioned earlier, Mrs. Carr, who I got to know a little bit in her later years, spoke very glowingly of his commitment. He was always trying to figure out what can we do to advance the struggle. And the thing about Montgomery that is important to understand is that it's the capital. It has a very interesting sort of class composition because you have Alabama State, which is sort of like a black college, and you have a series of black people there who have a kind of educational background that allows them to do certain kinds of things like Joanne Robinson. Then you have networked activists coming out of labor like E.D. Nixon. And then E.D. is also part of the formal network in the NAACP. And what happens is that people work through these various networks, and he is very, very important in bringing sort of that labor emphasis as well as the political emphasis in the NAACP.
So it's my understanding too that it's E.D. Nixon's idea to call Martin Luther King, or to.
Yeah.
That's my understanding.
No. I mean, how King gets called is very interesting. I think a lot of people think that it was all of this was a foregone conclusion. King was a very young minister who had just gotten there. I think he just finished his degree and all of this. And Edie and a few other people liked him, but he was, they didn't know a lot about him other than the fact that people heard a lot of good things about him. He's a powerful preacher and all of this. I think the thing that set King apart was that because he was new, he was not beholden to any constituencies, any downtown constituencies, any sort of like white constituencies. People felt that he could more or less chart his own path, and that he would be good, be a good choice because he was relatively uncaught up with all of the things that people who had been there for years might be caught up with. So he was fresh, he was young, he was energetic, and the people who knew him thought he was a wonderful preacher. So, but Ed was huge in helping to bring forward King's, bring forward King. But a lot of other people say, "What? It was my idea." But I think without Ed's support, it never would have happened. Ed was absolutely pivotal.
So we have all these people, Rosa Parks and Joanne Robinson and E.D. Nixon, these grassroots leaders, these women leaders, who have been laying the groundwork for a long time. But then shortly after the boycott starts, the ministers very quickly take over the leadership positions. And a lot of the women especially really kind of sink into the background. Why does this happen?
Well, I think it's the way in which we think about social movements. I think we tend to highlight and emphasize sort of the top-down leadership. The actual day-to-day running of the boycott, what they one of the things they did was they created an alternative sort of transportation system where if you needed to get from one point to another point, you would call in and people would come get you and take you where you needed to go. And then sort of support, all kinds of social support for people engaged in sort of that kind of struggle, as well as sort of the mass meetings where they would come together in churches to sort of like keep the spirit up and keep the spirit moving and stuff like that. But if you look at the on the ground struggle, and especially the sort of the mass meetings in churches, and if you look at who's calling and setting up these alternative networks for people to get from point A to point B, I mean, women are huge in all of that. So the on the ground, day to day leadership of the actual struggle, women are all over the place. The Montgomery Improvement Association, which is the formal organization created to sort of like bring together the various strands of leadership, featured the ministerial leadership because the ministerial leadership was the dominant leadership, and that was predominantly male. And so that's one of the reasons King's profile was from day one huge, because he was the leader, and the ministerial leadership, was the dominant political leadership. The thing that I would emphasize here that would sort of, I think, help to us to think about this is Ella Baker, who was sort of a longtime activist, African-American woman who's huge in the freedom struggle, had this distinction between what she called leader-centered movements and movement-centered leaders. And she really favored, movement-centered leaders. In other words, you prioritize and you center the struggle, and the individuals, are less important than the struggle. And what she feared, and what some people, sort of saw happening, was you begin to create sort of a cult or a personality around leaders, and especially big profile leaders. And she understood that organizing and mobilizing a struggle, that's not the way struggles are. They're on the ground. They're ordinary people, and ordinary people include women, and they include working class and poor people. So you have to have ways of connecting with them. And I think the this sort of way in which a lot of the history is told from the perspective of a top-down, predominantly male leadership is a very flawed perspective. I really think that needs to be broadened. I think it really we also need to come from the bottom up. In social movements, and especially in the Montgomery bus boycott, thousands of ordinary African Americans stayed off the buses. And their experiences, not only staying off the buses, but their work experiences, their school experiences, their day-to-day experiences, and how this struggle informed and shaped all of that, is something that I think is very, very important, because that's what social struggle is. Social struggle isn't, King standing up there giving a big speech, which is what a lot of people focus on, because that's sort of a top-down leader-centered view of what's happening. But the way you make and sustain social struggle is at the local level. And I think we need to have more emphasis on the local level, and what people actually do say, and how it works itself out in various networks, in various institutions, and in various places on the ground.
Can we talk a little bit about that? Like, what were some of the strategies at play on the ground? What were ordinary people doing to sustain this boycott? What did they do to raise money? What did they do when they felt in danger? I'm sure there were all kinds of things they
Yeah.
had to think about.
I think the communities organized primarily through the churches, and the churches not only raised money, but the churches, I would really emphasize the role of the mass meeting, because people come to the mass meeting not only to, hear good preaching and to, hear people like King, but to, feel, how be emboldened to find sort of a spiritual, emotional, and psychological sort of the resources that can sustain them and push them forward. And so I think there's something psychological, emotional, and spiritual. And then I think that ties in with the larger political issues and the larger moral and ethical issues. So I think mass meetings are absolutely pivotal. There are all kinds of, a range of other kinds of activities where people are fundraising activities, and bake sales, all the things that churches and groups do. The other thing that I would emphasize is the strong national support that church, especially church networks, provide, and various individuals provide, bringing money, especially support money and the like, into Montgomery. The other thing that they do is they sponsor sort of social events, or political events, explaining what's happening. A lot of this happens in mass meetings. A lot of it happens in other venues. And there's a lot in this alternative sort of network for transportation. There's also sort of efforts made to help individuals who might have suffered as a result of, some, an employee being fired,
Mm-hmm.
or being threatened or intimidated. A lot of support went to trying to help those individuals, and things like that. So I think a lot of it is sort of social outreach, social work, trying to help the individuals and to help to sustain them, not only sort of, you know, spiritually, emotionally, but also oftentimes financially, if indeed they were being intimidated or threatened with job loss, or in some cases actually losing jobs because, of their activism.